Very well, there may be other charges, but for now, Abigail Ruth Davis, I am placing you under arrest for the attempted murder of Samantha Lloyd Smith. You do not need to say anything. And that's when my wife passed out. If I had reacted quickly enough, I might have been able to catch her before she hit the ground. At the same time, I figured it would be a much lighter blow than the one she intended for Sammy, so I just made a half-hearted attempt that was unlikely to succeed. Chapter 1. Perhaps before I continue, I should introduce you to the main participants in this little drama, and I'll start with myself. My name is Robert Davis, Robbie to my friends, and I'm an unexpected accountant. That means I grew up in a pretty disadvantaged neighborhood, and most of my peers, at least those who didn't go to prison, either became day laborers or joined the ranks of the long-term unemployed. I was lucky. I went to work in a carpet factory and having quickly demonstrated a gift for making a mess of whatever loom I was sitting at, was transferred to the stores. After a while, my ability to organize as well as my easy gift for numbers caught the eye of the factory owner, Griffin Lloyd, and he transferred me to the shipping department. For no particular reason, I took an accounting course at the local further education college, found that I really enjoyed it. No, honestly. And after getting an exceptionally high score, Old Man Lloyd transferred me to the head office and helped me train to become a chartered accountant. No, it was there that I first met his beautiful daughter, Samantha. And strange to say now, it was hate at first sight. She was nothing like her father. If he was a nice guy who worked damn hard to get his way, she was a completely spoiled brat. An only child indulged by her father and pushed up the social scale by her ambitious mother. I'm sure you know the type of person I'm talking about. You may have met one or two. But I was the unfortunate one chosen to mentor her on her journey from gifted wealth to partially earned wealth. To make matters worse, she was simply gorgeous. Beautiful, long blonde hair, the sweetest face imaginable, a full, feminine figure even at 19, and a pair of legs that trampled the wet dreams of most male employees. And she knew it. Simply put, she was a tantalizing bitch. A couple of years later, she married Gerald. Please don't call me Jerry, it's universally accepted. Smith, who seemed like the perfect match. She was flirtatious. He thought he was a catch. She was spoiled. He was an arrogant asshole. She had lots of money. He led a lifestyle that demanded it. But now it's time to bring the last of this small cast to the stage. Enter Abigail Ruth Marley, as she was when I first met her. She worked in the factory as one of the creelers. That is, she sorted skeins of wool or nylon and operated one of the machines that transferred them into the plastic cones used to feed the threads to the looms. Like me, she came from a municipal area, but unlike me, she did nothing to further her education. No, Abby decided that her looks would be enough to get her out of poverty. All she needed was a man who would be impressed with her looks and skill to take her from hard times to easy street. And I'm sure you can guess who she chose. I wasn't a total dork and I wasn't completely inexperienced, but Abby was pretty hard to resist. She was 22 years old, I was 28 at the time, and she was stunning. Her raven black hair was cut rather short, almost boyish, but paradoxically it made her even more feminine. At the time, the company was on a large order to supply green carpeting for some Department of Defense facilities, and to get everything done on time, the boss allowed a lot of overtime in the evenings. The machines ran at full capacity until midnight, and then one of the key holders had to check that everything was turned off and lock up the premises. Naturally, being one of them, I had to be on duty a couple of times. I actually had to take on more than I should have, because Samantha couldn't give up her social obligations, and the boss was already feeling the effects of an illness that would lead to his death within a year or so. It was early December, so there was no shortage of volunteers willing to work overtime with the prospect of a big paycheck by Christmas, and it was on the first night that the snow began to fall. Snow doesn't fall very often in our part of the world, so no one is prepared for it. Given the risk of people having trouble getting home, I let them finish an hour early and did the usual chores before heading out into the icy wind and locking the door. I happily got behind the wheel of my Land Rover, even though there was an inch or two of snow on the roads by then, and as I pulled out of the parking lot, I saw Abby standing longingly at the bus stop. I stopped next to her and asked if she was okay, and she told me that she had been run down by the elevator because her sister didn't know how to drive in those conditions. I had seen her sister's car, a Mondeo, and knew that on this kind of pavement, rear-wheel drive would turn her into a ballerina pirouetting all over the road. So I offered her a ride. She was grateful, of course, especially since she was freezing, and I let her use my cell phone to let my sister know she was okay. On the way, she still lived on the estate where we both grew up. We chatted merrily. She was excited because the foreman had found her another job after her vacation. She was going to be a picker, one of those women who inspects every piece of carpet, pulling out the bad stitches and finding the missing ones before sewing them on by hand. I think I was flirting a bit. I didn't have a girlfriend at the time, and as I said, she was very attractive, so it was only natural. And I guess I told her that a man with her looks should be on top of things, not doing such a chore. We laughed a little, and I enjoyed her company during the half-hour drive. When we pulled up to her house, she asked if I wanted to stop by for a cup of coffee, but I politely declined. Instead, she thanked me with a kiss. I don't think I slept well that night. Over the years at the plant, I'd had many opportunities to have fun with some women, both single and married, but I tried to stay away from them. I was well aware of the complications this could lead to, especially if one of them worked on the floor and the other was part of the management team. So I tried my best to forget about it and kept my distance from her. Until the last day before the holidays. The machines closed at lunchtime that day, a full Christmas lunch was served in the canteen, and of course most of the staff brought their refreshments. The mood was very good because everyone got their pay slips, inflated from overtime with an early completion bonus, and the usual holiday pay and bonus. Admittedly, it was a bit hectic because Griffin Lloyd had been admitted to hospital the day before, and I think everyone was concerned. Not only was the old man a beloved employer who treated his employees fairly, but he was worried about who would take responsibility if something happened to him. The other directors were his wife, who had been to the factory no more than a dozen times. Samantha, who it must be admitted, was much less arrogant than she used to be. Her husband, who hadn't changed a bit, except that he had decided he was now a captain of industry with ideas to revolutionize manufacturing, and me as the company accountant. Besides us, there were 3 other small shareholders in the company, who only came to board meetings for the free drinks and buffet. No wonder they were worried. Nevertheless, the party soon got into full swing. Eventually, the tables were cleared to one side. Ghetto blaster music, remember them? Started playing. People let their hair down and started dancing. As usual, I was dragged into the affair. At that age, being single and earning well, I was probably considered an eligible bachelor, and some of the women were clearly interested. But they didn't stand a chance because Abby had settled on me, and the only dances I didn't dance with her were the ones I danced with Sammy. I had never seen Sammy at any of these informal parties, so it came as a surprise to me that I was dancing next to her. I was also shocked when she whispered, "Be careful with that one. She's trying to get a hold of you. And you can do so much better." And then, just as the tune ended and we dispersed, Gerald appeared, waved imperiously, wished everyone a happy holiday loudly, and they both disappeared. She was probably right, but I was too dumb to realize it. About 10 minutes later, Abby reappeared wherever she was, and then stayed and waited for me to close the door. Then, as I was about to leave, she suddenly said, "Shit, I left my shoes in the warehouse." She explained that she'd left her flat-heeled shoes there and changed into the ones she'd been dancing in, and I went back into the house with her. I think I guessed what was about to happen, but honestly, I didn't really feel like it. She led me through aisles with rolls of rugs until we came to a place where small mats were stacked. Her shoes, she said, were on the floor in a bag. Being a gentleman, I stooped to pick them up, and when I straightened up, she was standing opposite me, uncomfortably close, one arm raised. Not surprisingly, she was holding mistletoe in her hand. If I wanted to summarize what followed, I'd say that even if it didn't blow my socks off, I definitely enjoyed it. Don't worry, but if you want to make it up to me, I won't argue. Just not here. If that's okay with you? And where do you suggest? Well, I don't know. It won't be much fun at my house. Mom and Dad are busy packing to spend Christmas at Aunt Norma's, and my sister and her boyfriend are probably waiting until they leave to dive into the bedroom. How about my apartment? I innocently suggested, not realizing that those 4 words practically sealed my fate. I cut to the chase. I took her to my apartment, quite decent, with 2 bedrooms and a beautiful view of the sea, and she was very impressed. After we spent a few hours testing the firmness of my big bed and letting me make inquiries about the factory, she wanted to look around. You know how you scrutinize a place you're about to buy? She seemed to be drooling, saying that she loves to cook and having a kitchen like this was one of her main desires, but it was the living room that made her wince. Perhaps I'm used to this view by now, but her reaction made me remember the first time I was able to look out over the expanse of the bay and watch the ebb and flow of the tide. I think I said something trite about how the view is so much better when she's part of it. Okay, I admit it, I did say that. And she hugged me, kissed me, thanked me, and in a moment we were back under the covers. The next day was Christmas Eve, and when we woke up, we found the ground covered in a light but very pretty hoarfrost. After a good session, which was very enjoyable for both of us, she insisted on cooking breakfast, proof that she definitely knows her way around a kitchen, and we sat down at the dining table to talk. The conversation quickly turned to what we were going to do the next day. I planned to eat out of the microwave, watch TV, and possibly spend time on the internet. She was to watch TV and try not to listen to her sister entertaining noisily in the bedroom. It seemed reasonable enough if negotiated for something better. I left her at home to pick out her clothes, while I went to the supermarket myself and made a list of the groceries she asked me to buy so she could cook a proper meal for us. It was all very romantic, perhaps because I didn't notice that I was being manipulated. We ended up having a wonderful holiday together, caroling in the town square that evening and a bag of roasted chestnuts to eat on the way home. Christmas spent trying to entertain each other, and Boxing Day when I showed her the local flying club and explained that I needed the adrenaline rush of skydiving to offset the boredom of my work week. She had her doubts about this, quite serious to be honest, but she was a game girl. You've got to hand it to her. Her first jump with a qualified instructor was in early February. There were 6 more before the end of the month, and in early March she made her first solo descent. And it was when she landed that I proposed to her by giving her an engagement ring. Slushy? Yeah. Romantic? Yeah. And then some asshole ruined it by saying, "Oh, that's nice. The council house kids are getting married in their class." Turning around, I saw Gerald Smith's smirking face and didn't hesitate to punch him in the stomach. "You're a bloody idiot," I heard Samantha say and was about to contradict her, but realized she was addressing the remark to her astonished husband. "Sorry, Robbie," she said, turning to me. He had a few drinks at lunch and had verbal diarrhea. Then she turned on her heel and walked away without even dignifying us with a glance. So Abby and I were still watching her leave with our mouths open in surprise when Gerald rose to his feet. He wiped the vomit from his overgrown goatee beard and muttered, "You've made a big mistake, Davis. One lucky punch doesn't mean it's over. Not at all. As soon as you're ready for more, just let me know. Jerry?" I groaned and turned away, finding Abby still in a state of shock. I gently took her hand and walked away. So the engagement fell through, but we got over it and got married a couple months later. We weren't comfortable working in the same place, so after returning from our honeymoon in Tenerife, Abby applied for and found a job at an employment agency that was only a short walk from our apartment. Although she never took her education too seriously, she was bright enough to adapt to the office environment and, although I dare not say it, I think she was hired mainly because she was very nice eye candy when she took over the receptionist's desk. Things worked out just fine those first couple years. We weren't rich, but our combined incomes made us feel quite comfortable. My charming young wife turned out to be a good housekeeper and cook, as well as surprisingly resourceful in the bedroom. I knew, of course, that she had a bit of a past. She never denied having been around a bit before we got together, but the same applied to me, so I had nothing to complain about in that respect. Once we were both properly outfitted for skydiving, we only had to pay for the jumps themselves, plus, of course, periodic replacements and upgrades, and we lived very comfortably, although Abby had a passion for new clothes that sometimes threatened to get out of hand. We even quarreled about it on occasion, and although most of the time I yielded to her, there were times when I had to give in on one issue or another. After Griffin Lloyd's death at work, I felt uncomfortable for some time. Gerald had tried to force his opinion on me, but as I was well aware, he had only a nominal amount of shares in the business. The vast majority were in Samantha's name only. Fortunately, things were resolved fairly quickly. We were at a board meeting and he actually tried to get me fired. Samantha put him in his place. Before anyone guesses to confirm it, she said. I'll tell you that Robbie taught me everything I know about this business, and to be honest, I think he's the only one who really knows how things work. So vote in favor if you want, but as chairman and majority shareholder, I can promise you I'll veto it. They stared at each other in sepulchral silence for a few seconds, and then Gerald stepped back. We all knew full well that Sammy was his meal ticket. He'd managed to squander the inheritance his parents had left him, and she kept him on a short leash. I knew he wanted me out of the way because I was vigilant enough to keep him from touching the company's financial resources. They stayed after the others left, obviously to talk, but I realized I'd forgotten some of my notes and was about to go back for them when I heard Gerald's gruff voice. You've always had a thing for that damn Davis, haven't you? And I know exactly what part of your body that soft spot is in. What else did he teach you? You're like a bitch in heat when he's around. At that point, I stopped listening because I didn't want to hear anything else. I quietly crawled aside and walked back into the office, not quite sure what I had heard. Like I said, Samantha and I hadn't gotten along very well when we first started working together. I thought she was goofy, and she probably thought I was boring. In fact, given my background, I assumed that she thought I was too ordinary for her taste, and that all the teasing and flirting was just a way to torment me. Could I have been wrong? Well, it was too late for regrets. Not that I regretted anything, of course, because things were still very good in my marriage, even if her marriage didn't seem so happy. I liked her, and she was still gorgeous, but that didn't stop me from thinking. I told Abby about the board meeting that night, but was glad I didn't have time to tell her about what Gerald had said later because Abby suddenly interrupted me by saying, "Watch out for that arrogant bitch. I always knew she had a thing for you. She'd love to get her hands on you," familiar phrase. "And if she succeeds, I can't imagine what she'll do to you." "So, you're definitely not up for a threesome?" I asked. For a moment I thought she was going to destroy me, but then she saw the look on my face, burst into laughter, and called me a pig, a bastard, and a bunch of other things I can't remember right now. So, as you can see, I was doing pretty well by then. I had a decent, albeit somewhat boring job that paid well and was secure. I had a beautiful and loving wife, and also, if what I had heard was true, a rich and beautiful lady. I don't know when exactly it all went wrong. It probably took a long time before I realized what was going on, but it all went wrong. Chapter 2. The first sign that something wasn't as it should be came when Abby suddenly lost her enthusiasm for skydiving. I don't mean gradually, I mean it happened suddenly, like a light switch. We had very nice weather that summer and had plenty of opportunities to jump out of airplanes, fly, and hurtle toward the ground at about 120 miles per hour. I know that sounds dangerous, and there are 50 to 70 fatalities reported each year. Most people think that equipment failure is common, but it really isn't. Most accidents are caused by simple mistakes and misconceptions. For fully trained people, fatalities average 1 in 100,000 jumps. Compare this to driving a car, for example. If you drive 10,000 miles a year, your chance of having an accident in any given year is about 1 in 6,000. Abby knew all this, we'd talked about it many times, but as she began to insist, for some completely inexplicable reason, the risk of accidents and fatalities is much higher for women than for men. So she stopped. The last one was a tandem jump. We did together on her 24th birthday, just a couple months after our first anniversary. For the first couple weeks after that, she went with me to watch. I thought it was more likely she wanted to keep an eye on what Samantha could do than anything else. But then she said it was more nerve-wracking to watch it than to do it, and left me alone. Of course, I was ready to quit, but she insisted that I keep doing it as long as I enjoyed it. Surprisingly, the second week, Samantha was also left alone. Apparently, Gerald had hurt his back falling off his horse and was going to have a long, slow recovery process before he could strap on his parachute again. But Abby didn't seem too bothered that Samantha and I were unaccompanied. So I continued to pursue my hobby, and my usual companion was Samantha, not my wife. Just don't think anything bad of it. By then, Samantha and I were getting along very well. She had changed beyond recognition from the snotty snob I'd first met. And besides being a good businesswoman, she was a lot of fun to be with. We laughed a lot and got along well with each other, but not much more than that. Did I like her? She liked me. Did she like me? By now, I was sure she did. Could either of us do anything about it? Not a chance. We became very good buddies, talked a lot, and sometimes confided in each other. That's why one Sunday afternoon, when we were able to take advantage of the friendly heat currents and floated in the air for ages instead of hurtling toward the ground, I had a hard time understanding why she seemed so depressed. We sat in the small clubhouse sipping cool soft drinks. No alcohol was served until all the day's flights were over, and I tried to figure out what was wrong with her. At first, she denied that anything was wrong with her, but after a few cautious attempts and a fair amount of patience, she finally said, "Okay then, what would you do, Robbie, if you thought your partner was cheating on you?" "What? You mean, I don't know. I really don't know," she insisted, "but I think Gerald might be having an affair." "Good God, really?" I replied, surprised, and not at all sure I wanted to find out further. "Yes, really," she replied with a forced smile. And then, "Look, Robbie, I don't want to hurt you, but I need to talk to someone I can trust, and, well, I don't have anything to offer right now." "Oh, sure. No, I'm serious. At work, they're all a bit intimidated by who and what I am. And in recent years, I've become increasingly disillusioned with our so-called social set. I dare say many women in my shoes would turn to their mothers, but let's not talk about that." That brought a wry smile to my face. Her mother never cared about anything as much as her position on the social scale. From what I understood, she had persisted in getting Samantha and Gerald together because he was from the right family, the one with old money, to give respectability to their newly acquired wealth. It made me nervous that the old witch would retain controlling interest after my husband's death, because I'd already had a couple of unpleasant encounters with her in the past. So I simply nodded in understanding. "You're the only one who treated me the way I deserve to be treated, Robbie. No, don't deny it. When I acted like a bitch in the office, you were always willing to treat me like one and put me in my place. Even though you did it with a light hand, you were also willing to praise me on those occasions when I deserved it. You may speak softly, Robbie, but you don't take shit from anyone. And you solve problems your own way, quietly. You don't go around complaining to other people, and I know for a fact that you're not interested in gossip and scandal. There are lots of other things, Robbie. And the thing is, I used to think of you as someone I could trust. You're probably the only one, to be honest." "Wow, I'm honored," I said, perhaps a little non-seriously, but when I realized the unshed tears glistening in her eyes, I continued. "Look, I'm your friend, Sammy. I wouldn't have said that when I first met you. You were a pain back in the day. But you've changed a lot since then. A hell of a lot, to be honest. If there's anything I can do to help you, well, you know," I finished lamely. "Sam, I need you to promise me that you won't tell anyone about what I'm about to say, Robbie. Can you do that?" I started to nod, but she added, "Not even your Abby." And I had to think for a moment. I don't like keeping secrets, but as long as it didn't involve her directly, I figured there was no harm done. In the end, I agreed and gave her my word that everything would remain a secret. Even though there was no one around us, she spoke in a low voice. "Yeah, and you probably know that things are not as they should be between Gerald and me. And since you're not a fool, you probably realize that we haven't been happy together for a long time. Maybe I was a fool, but it just didn't occur to me. I really didn't like the man. I thought he was a poser, a slacker, and a complete moron. But I didn't usually look at other couples to see if they were happy or not. I'd never considered it my business. So I stayed silent and let her continue. The thing is, it was fine at first. I mean, it seemed like we were two equal people, you know? My dad was never too sure about Gerald, but my mom thought he was perfect. She used to say, "At least you can be sure he's not just after your money." But she was wrong, Robbie. I soon found out that he was close to being penniless when we got married, but, well, you know how it is. He told me that he'd had bad luck with supposedly safe investments, that he'd been cheated by unscrupulous partners. Oh, things happen. Of course, I was still in love with him and perhaps a little naive. I swallowed it all, hook, line, and sinker. It didn't take Daddy long to figure him out. He gave him jobs that didn't require much effort, that he couldn't screw up, and paid him far more than he was worth. But he made me promise that I wouldn't let him squander what Daddy was so diligently providing. Even before the end of our first year together, I discovered that he was playing on the side. There was one of the secretaries at the law firm that he was swamping with dinners and lunches when he said he was taking clients. Remember when you inquired about his expenses? He was afraid you'd come to me with that question. But you never did. He didn't have to. He was scared enough to drop it like a red-hot brick, and it gave him another reason to hate you, Robbie. So, since I didn't tell you, I asked, I found out about it by studying your notes. I know no one usually studies them. Who the hell would study everything an accountant writes? But you've always been very meticulous. I remember you telling me how important these things are in business, so I studied them. Don't look so guilty, Robbie. I already knew that. Your notes just confirmed it. Anyway, there were others after that. Of course, I was never able to prove any of them, but at least he stopped trying to use the company account to fund his dirty deeds. He, of course, denied all of this when I challenged him. He simply claimed that his position as head of sales meant that he had to have a lot of fun in his spare time. It was nothing more than a nominal position, I said quietly. I realized that over time, my father simply gave him the position to create the appearance of his usefulness. I know now that it was Freddie Watson who attracted most of the new business. She paused and I interjected. So, if you knew he was having affairs, why did you tolerate it? And why did you suddenly decide to? I tolerated it, she almost whispered. Partly because I couldn't get over the conflict with my mother, and also because I didn't want to sleep in the same bed with him anymore. We had a big fight because he has some very strange… Well, I won't tell you about it. Suffice it to say, it was a big fight and we ended up sleeping in separate rooms now. As for the second question, all those affairs he had were short-lived and clearly not very important to him. They were mostly with friends' wives. I think he got some kind of high from it. I think it fueled his superiority complex or something. Or maybe he was just trying to hide his inferiority by racking up a bunch of conquests. Either way, it was pretty obvious that they didn't mean much to him. But whatever he's doing now, it seems to be more serious than that. How do you know? I asked. It all started when he started spending a lot of time on the computer. Actually, quite a lot of time. And when I looked into it, I found that it had all sorts of password-protected stuff on there. That worried me a little bit. I tried to convince myself that he was probably looking at illegal sites and didn't want me to know about it. But it kept me on my toes until… Well, this may sound a little… well, you know, but I asked an old high school friend who's a bit of a genius at this sort of thing to help me hack it. Of course, I didn't tell her the truth about what it was. I just told her that it belonged to a man I suspected of passing confidential information about our contract bids to a competitor. Anyway, she added some clever hardware to it, and about a week later she came back, removed the device, and gave me a list of all the passwords. She made it look so easy. Anyway, once I had them, I didn't immediately discover that there were emails flying back and forth between Gerald and some damsel calling herself Mrs. Hotandvet. I downloaded copies and read them all. There are hundreds of them, and they date back more than 6 months. Most of them, especially the early ones, were exactly what you'd expect. You know, there were low-key declarations of love and then a bunch of direct words about what they wanted to do together and how they'd enjoy it. Those confessions made me shudder. I mean, I'm not a prude or anything, Robbie, but… I'm sorry, I'm really sorry, Sammy, I said, as she pulled out a small handkerchief and wiped the tears from her eyes as discreetly as possible. But the thing is, Robbie, I was able to take it all in. In a way, I was glad he had someone else to indulge in all his disgusting. You know, at least it meant I didn't have to. But recent events were starting to scare me. They've started talking about how soon they'll both be free and able to be together. They keep mentioning some plan to get me and her husband out of the way, although they don't specify what that plan is. There are even a couple instances where she reminds him that everything has to be in writing so he can't try to leave her when she helps him get into a state. I'm scared, Robbie. I'm really scared. Why didn't you go to the police? I asked. Because I probably would have been made a fool of. If I had to, I'm sure they'd say it was just a game. They could say it was nothing more than an online chat, that they were just chatting about fantasies and nothing of the sort happened. And anyway, it's not like I'm in any direct danger of harm, come to think of it. And you don't know who this woman is? No, I don't know anything at all. At first I thought it was one of the girls on our fundraising committee for the local hospice. I know she's partial to Gerald, but I ruled her out when I saw one of the reports she wrote. Whoever Mrs. Hotandvet is, she almost always misspells the letters E and I when she writes words like relief and never bothers to capitalize them. I think at this point we were joined by other participants who had just gotten an adrenaline rush and were ready to talk for hours about the joys of flying in the sky. So we had to leave the discussion where it was. Eventually, I had to leave and I just told them all to take care. But Sammy knew I was addressing her specifically when I said that. As I drove home, I thought deeply, and honestly, if I hadn't given Samantha my word, I wondered if I would have discussed it with Abby. Although it probably wouldn't have happened even then, because at the time we were going through what some married couples call a rough patch. After our first few months together, I discovered two things about Abby that I didn't really like. The first was that she couldn't help but flirt with other men. It wasn't a serious problem. She just attracted them without even trying. And as soon as she looked at them with her smoky brown eyes, they turned into puppies begging to be petted. I guess I couldn't blame her for craving attention, especially if the man was handsome. But she never crossed the line. I mean, she was always quick to introduce me as her husband and made sure I was always fully included in any conversation. But I was often uncomfortable with the way they would look at her, and then at me, with a look that said, "You better not be here, buddy." We talked about it several times, but she always replied the same thing. "It doesn't mean anything. He was just flirting with me. I didn't ask him out. Do you want me to be rude to him? Don't you like it when other men find me attractive?" I didn't show cleavage, and my skirt is a decent length, and if I still wasn't happy, I'd say, "For heaven's sake, Robbie, do you want me to wear a burqa when we go out?" That's what I decided, sort of. I still wasn't happy about it. I let her know I didn't want her to, and she started showing more restraint. Things settled down for a week or two, but the day my car was in service and she came to pick me up from work, it happened again. Had I been in my office, I wouldn't have seen it pull up and park at the employee entrance. But I was in Freddie Watson's office discussing a major contract he was trying to negotiate in Belgium and trying to figure out a way to cut transportation costs. Fortunately, he had his back to the window, so I was the only one who saw her climb out of the little Mazda MX-5 she loved so much and be greeted by three guys she used to work with. Okay, it was one thing to greet old coworkers with a smile or even, at most, a peck on the cheek, but they went much further than that. Each of them, in turn, received a long kiss on the lips as they hugged her tightly. One of them even snuggled up to her. I finished my business with Freddie as quickly as possible and hurried down the stairs to the main door, just as she pulled up and parked in my reserved spot. I don't make hasty decisions. Perhaps that's why I'm one of the few people on the estate who made it to adulthood without getting into trouble. So I accepted the kiss on the cheek as I climbed into the car and waited, mulling it over as we drove home. I carelessly asked her if she'd just arrived, and when she said yes, I knew what I had to do. She was stunned and completely unsure of what to do when I told her what I had seen. Naturally, she tried to say they were just old buddies and so on, but I lost my temper. It was the first time she'd seen me like that. "I don't care who or what they were," shouted I. "I don't care that they were probably entertaining you long before me. If I ever see you acting like that with any man again, you'll be out the door and back to your parents before you can stick your tongue out of your mouth. Do I make myself clear?" There were a lot of tears that night before bed, but I let her know I meant every word. And then there was the second. It concerned what we did in the bedroom. In those first few months, we had exhausted everything our previous partners had taught us. Everything was just fine. Sure, there were times when we weren't in the mood, but they were very few. Gradually, however, she began to want more. After a while, she started talking about married people cheating. I didn't really like them, and once she realized that, she moved on to stories about cheating, open marriages, wives living together, and the like. I wasn't entirely comfortable with that, but at least there wasn't the same element of deception here, and at least she had found a site where some of it was well written enough to be believed. Of course, I asked her if she liked it, and after several denials, she finally admitted that she used some of them as fantasies when we were together. That might seem strange to some, but it didn't bother me too much because, frankly, there had been times when I'd been guilty of something like that myself. The problem was that she was starting to take my consent the wrong way. Very gently, she started asking questions about whether I really enjoyed watching her with someone else, or whether I wanted the thrill with another couple. Of course, she pretended she was just watching what I was saying, not trying to turn me on. But when she finally pushed me too hard one night, and I told her that if she was getting thoughts like that in her head, she should stop reading these stories, I think she finally realized that I just wasn't cut out for this. And then she started buying herself weird things so she wouldn't miss me. She reasoned that she wanted to make sure we never got bored of each other. All she wanted was to be modest at work, perfect in the kitchen, and such a complete brownie in the bedroom that I would never be tempted to drift away. Well, you can't argue with that unless, of course, you insist that I'm perfectly happy the way I am, and for a few weeks I couldn't be sure what each day would bring in the mail. However, on Saturday, on my way home from the skydiving club, I heard her announce that she was waiting for me in the bedroom. This seemed like good news because I was having a great day, and the thought definitely appealed to me, until I got to the bedroom. She was dressed like a cheap whore and was offering me questionable things. No, I said. There seemed to be nothing more to say. I said it softly because she had clearly put a lot of effort into setting this up, but God knows where she got the idea that I would agree to it. I'm not asking you. I'm telling you, she growled. For a couple moments, I just stared at her. Then I told her I needed something to eat, and if she didn't make anything, I'd send for it. For a couple moments, she just stared at me as if she couldn't believe I was denying her. And then her eyes widened. Her breathing became rapid and ragged, and she started screaming hysterically at me. Suddenly, she thought I was a control freak who wanted to ruin all her fun. I was too bored to try anything new or different. I was insensitive and boring. Then I calmly turned away, told her to stop, and went downstairs to call and order a pizza. She and I didn't see each other for the rest of that evening, and nothing was ever resolved in the months that followed. I tried to talk about it a couple times. You don't want to try anything, she complained. And how do you know you won't like it? It went on like this for months, ad hoc, but I never knew what mood she would be in on any given day. I began to think that if things didn't improve soon, it would be best for both of us if we closed the curtain on our marriage. As much as I wanted to, and as much as I tried to convince myself that there was still a lot of love between us, I realized that it couldn't go on like this forever. So I was unlikely to go home and discuss Samantha's problem with Abby that day, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that waiting was futile, and that the best thing to do would be to convince her to call the police and at least report my concerns. When I got home Sunday night, Abby was nowhere to be seen. I vaguely remembered her saying she might stop by my mom's house, so I wasn't too surprised by her absence. As I often did, I found a cooked meal in the freezer and stuck it in the microwave. After that, I called her cell phone and found out she was having drinks at the Forrester's Arms with her sister. It was quiet, although I could hear her sister's loud voice in the background. She said she'd be home in a couple hours, and after I warned her not to drive, promised she'd call me to come and pick her up. Since there was nothing to do, I decided to surf the internet a bit and check all the sports scores for the day. I used Abby's laptop because mine was still in its case in the car. I booted it up, found the information I needed, and when I was done, I started looking through the various folders. One of them was called Bits and Bobs, and when I opened it, it turned out to have hundreds of icons and almost as many subfolders. Since I'd opened it once before, I knew it held a bunch of stuff, from old photos to stories she'd tried to write herself but usually gave up after half a page or so. She was also downloading stories she liked from one of her favorite sites, and knowing this, I started using that site to see what she was reading so I could, hopefully, anticipate what she'd throw out to me next. It was clear from the latest readings that she had spent some time reading stories, as it turned out, mostly about cheating wives. I sighed, deciding that wasn't going to help her deal with our problems. Then I glanced at one of the folders that seemed completely out of place. It was called System Information, so I clicked on it and found a subfolder labeled Do Not Modify, which led to another and another folder, until I finally got to the one with a warning that opening it could damage the computer. Anyone with a modicum of common sense knew that such a warning was bullshit, and so it proved to be. After going through 3 subfolders, I got to the link to the email icon and without hesitation, clicked on it. I wasn't the least bit surprised to find that the email was password protected. I stared at it for a minute or two, and then, as if it was the most natural thing in the world, I typed in the password and it opened. Sammy said the letter was missing capital letters and misspelled words with an IE, both mistakes Abby tended to make. And that's what I discovered. Now, it took me quite a while to do what I thought I needed to do, though I barely glanced at the pictures she sometimes talked me into doing, or the ones she did herself. And without stopping to read any of it, I had time to finish my task and clean up any signs that I was doing it before I closed the computer when the phone rang. So Taking a deep breath, I got into my car and headed out to pick her up from the pub. Chapter 3. His name was Joe. He worked in a factory and was 28 years old. I think it was only his seventh solo jump, and he screamed like a banshee until he hit the ground. Then came the most complete silence I think I've ever heard in my life. Everyone stood and stared in shock at the spot where he'd fallen, with a crashing sound that we all later swore we'd actually heard. The first to recover were the St. John ambulance staff who always attended our meetings. In the past, they had had to treat a few ankle injuries from a clumsy landing and a couple of cuts and bruises, but they, like the rest of us, had never seen anything like this and rushed to the scene with their blue headlights flashing uselessly on the car. I immediately thought that I hoped the fall had killed him permanently. The only likely alternative was that he would be in a terrible state for the rest of his life. I watched him fall. I don't usually bother to do this, but he was one of Abby's friends, one of the ones she'd managed to talk into going with her. I think she'd actually talked them out of it, to provide more lively company on a dull afternoon so I could see clearly what had happened. One thing that skydivers fear perhaps more than anything else is a malfunction known as the horseshoe. Without going into technical details, this occurs when the parachute actually opens, but is still attached to the skydiver by the risers and at least one other point. This prevents the parachute from opening properly, and eventually the parachute and slings form a horseshoe shape. This most often happens when the closing pin of the parachute comes out of the closing loop, allowing the deploying bag to separate from the container. Of course, sometimes you can do the same thing as with any other high-speed malfunction. Just release the main canopy and use the reserve canopy. But what usually happens in this case is that the pilot's parachute shifts during the entanglement, and when it falls to the ground, the AAD, automatic activation device, on the reserve parachute is triggered. They become entangled, and there is an encounter with Mother Earth that is almost always fatal. This is far from an ordinary case, and the correct procedure for dealing with it can be practiced on the ground. But the ground is very different from flying to it. And who can say whether this practice will come to mind in a moment of blind panic? An hour earlier, Joe had been talking to Samantha and me in the kit room, showing her respect bordering on deference and barely concealing his contempt for me. I understood perfectly well why he felt that way, but as I watched the ambulance rush toward his motionless figure, I wasn't going to worry about it. Anyway, right now, I was busy trying to calm Sammy down. Her head was practically trying to pierce my sternum and burrow into it as she sobbed and shook, helpless and on the verge of hysterics. I could hardly blame her. Watching someone fall to the ground was bad enough for any human being, but for someone who had lent them their parachute, it had to be much worse. It could have been me, Robbie. I heard her weak voice between sobs. It could have been me. Shh. It's okay, I replied as soothingly as possible, putting my left arm around her shoulders and my right hand gently stroking her beautiful blonde hair. I could feel every tremor of her beautiful body as she clung to me so helplessly, trying to find comfort in our embrace. No. We stood like that for probably several minutes before I was finally able to free myself and lower her down onto one of the benches at the entrance to the club. She sobbed. It's all my fault. I shouldn't have. But then a new, even stronger flood of tears drowned out all other thoughts. I was about to sit down and talk her out of it when, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Mark Haley approaching. It was actually Detective Sergeant Mark Haley, if you called him by his full name, and he was very welcome. Like me, Mark was one of the few residents of our old neighborhood who had not gone over to the dark side, and like me, he was a committee member of the Parachute Club. Although he was a few years older, he was probably in his early 40s. He was a genuinely nice guy, and I always got on well with him. Who was that, Robbie? He asked without any preamble. The schedule said it was you and Sammy. How did that happen? We switched with Joe and Donald. Swapped on the manifest, I explained. Don used my parachute, and Joe used Sammy's parachute. But there's something much more important than that, Mark. He only raised his eyebrows slightly, and I continued. I don't think it was an accident. I have every reason to believe it may have been done intentionally, and it needs to be investigated. You need to send your guys down here to collect evidence, or whatever the hell they do. They're on their way, he assured me. I take it you know something about this that I don't. We both know, I said, nodding my head towards Sammy. But I think you'd better talk to me for now. Poor Sammy's in shock. As it happened, we were all required to give our first statements about what we had seen and what we knew about the accident. Mark and his senior officer, Detective Inspector Kelsey, set up in the small room we usually used for committee meetings, and one by one we were led in to give our version of events. The airfield was cordoned off, and although those who testified were allowed to go home, no outsiders were allowed in until it was over. While we waited, I sat at one of the windows and watched what was going on outside. There wasn't much to see. A few men in forensic suits were fussing over where Joe had landed, and another group was fiddling with the finished SMG-92 set airplane he'd taken on what would probably be his last flight. That could still be disputed, as word spread quickly that he was still alive, though only just. Perhaps it was because the ambulance had left the site with sirens howling and lights flashing. But I suspected it was only because the people from St. John's were in as much shock as the rest of us. Now, Samantha was at the other end of the room from me, being comforted by a policewoman, and I couldn't tell if she was awake or asleep because she seemed to hardly move at all. Mark organized everything very well. The first to volunteer their stories were those who hadn't seen what happened, and they were dealt with pretty quickly. Then there were those who were outside watching the screaming and thrashing figure rushing toward the ground in terror. And finally, the pilot of the plane. After him, Samantha was led into the room by her companion. I knew she would be there longer than the others, so I sat down to wait. I had smoked when I was younger, not heavily, no more than 10 cigarettes a day, and it wasn't hard to kick the habit, but as I sat there all alone, except for the uniformed constable sitting on a chair by the exit, I had a craving for nicotine for the first time in years. We had been asked to turn off our phones, so I couldn't contact anyone from the outside world. I assumed the news had already broken, and could only imagine the anxiety that had settled in the heads of the friends and family of all those who were to jump this afternoon. Eventually, after the better part of an hour, Samantha finally showed up. She was pale and trembling, and it seemed that without the support of the WPC she would not be able to stand, let alone walk. The policewoman looked at me and asked, "Mr. Davis?" I nodded, and she said, "You may come in." When I stood up, Samantha looked at me with bloodshot eyes and said, "I'm not going home, Robbie. I'm going to book a hotel room for now. Call me on my cell phone when you're free, okay? Please?" I could only nod. Seeing her like this made me feel awful, and I was afraid I would choke if I tried to say anything. I entered the conference room and found 3 people sitting at one of the long tables. I sat down and was introduced to each of them, and it was the one identified as Constable Robertson who started the conversation by asking my full name, address, date of birth, and so on. He then asked if I was an official of the club, and I replied that I was the treasurer. Despite being told that the interview was being recorded and pointing out the equipment being used, he recorded everything anyway. Then it was Mark's turn. "Robbie, could you tell me briefly about your qualifications? I mean the one related to skydiving?" "Well, I passed the ICC, it's an instructor certification course, but I've only had it for a few months. I have to take it at least a year before I become an instructor to qualify as a jump master. I also have a senior riggers certificate, which allows me to do minor repairs and stow the reserve and main parachutes. If you want details of all the jumps I've made and so on, they are naturally in my logbook, but I can tell you—" "That's all right, Robbie," Mark interrupted. And then Inspector Kelsey asked in a surprisingly soft voice, "So, Mr. Lloyd, does that mean you pack parachutes?" "Sometimes, yes. An instructor prefers to pack his own and all parachutes for his students, as he has probably told you before. I always pack my own and the one my wife uses. And a couple times lately, I've prepared Samantha's parachute for her." "You prepared it for her today?" Kelsey asked, giving me what he thought was an intimidating look. "No. She brought it with her, already packed and ready to fly. I think her husband did. You'll have to ask her about it. But he's qualified to do it, and he always did until he stopped coming lately after he hurt himself. Listen, by the way, about her husband. Can we—" "We know everything, Robbie," Mark assured me. "Samantha told us the whole story, so you don't need to worry about that right now. Right now, we'd like to focus on what happened and what you actually saw." And so, after asking a few questions to clear the air, I told them how I had arrived at the club that day and first checked what time my call, boarding time, would be. I then went through the usual procedure of checking the AGL altitude I would be jumping from, the trajectory of the jump, the wind line and aperture, upper airspeed, and all the other necessary things. Then I saw that Sammy had arrived, and I approached her to share the information I had gotten, but she had other concerns. She said she wanted to talk to me about a private matter. What kind of private matter? Inspector Kelsey interrupted. Well, I can't say exactly. Not that we've never had a private matter before, but I'm pretty sure I know what the conversation was about. For some reason, they brushed it off and asked me to pick up where I left off. There wasn't much to tell. I went to the office and rearranged the schedule so we wouldn't be arriving at the appointed time. There were a few spots available for later in the day, and I asked to be signed up for them. Sammy and I had just bought ourselves a couple of lemonades each and were seated at a quiet table when we were interrupted by Joe and his friend Donald. They said they had heard that we weren't flying the way we were supposed to and asked if there was any way we could borrow our parachutes. I asked if there were parachutes for guests. Usually there are quite a few, and they are always at the ready. But there was some party going on. Some company was having a team-building event or something. And they didn't have time to pack them. So Sammy volunteered to give Joe his, and I let Donald use mine. I knew we'd have plenty of time to pack them before we got the call. Now, can you explain why Joe wasn't tethered to what you call a static line? Kelsey asked. He had a Category 3, I explained. He was allowed to pull the rope himself, but I know he shouldn't have waited as long as he did, but to wait 10 seconds, you have to have a Category 4. Honestly, without wishing anything bad on him, I think he was a bit of a sky god, from what I've heard. Basically a bit of a show-off, Mark said, after Kelsey raised his eyebrows. A man who tries to do more than he has experience. There were a few more questions about what I'd actually seen, which was probably no more than anyone who'd been there. But then the questions suddenly changed direction. How well do you know Joseph Carpenter, Mr. Davis? Kelsey asked me, and I noticed he asked it in the present tense, so I answered, well, he works at the carpet factory, so I know him to talk to. I can't say I know him particularly well. He's only been working there for a couple years or so, and I spend most of my time in the office. So you're his boss? I suppose I am, sort of. But not directly. There are bosses for each area, and there's a foreman in charge of the whole shop. I'm just part of the management team. There was silence while the constable sorted through the notes. Then I saw Mark and Kelsey start interrupting each other as if they were talking nonstop, until finally the senior officer took a deep breath and, looking me straight in the eye, asked, Did you know, Mr. Davis, that Joseph Carpenter was having an affair with your wife? For a minute or two, I just stared straight at him. And I'm sure he saw the look of shock on my face when, in traditional English fashion, I finally managed to say, Excuse me. I mean, what did you say? He was the first to break eye contact and, slightly embarrassed, stared into his notes and said, According to several people, they were dating before your wedding. And afterward. Apparently that ended earlier this year. Did you know that? I didn't know what to answer, and I'm sure my response was indicative of the maelstrom of emotions bubbling deep inside me. Confusion, resentment, disbelief. All of it was visible to the other men in the room before I closed my eyes and dropped my chin to my chest. Slowly opening them, I saw a water bottle being pushed toward me and heard Mark's voice say, Sorry, Robbie. If you didn't know, that's a hell of a way to find out. But who? I mean, how? I can't believe it. I knew they were friends, but… Calm down, Robbie, Mark soothed. I'm surprised you didn't know, to be honest. I'm not saying it was common knowledge, but apparently he bragged about it to his work colleagues. He said his job would always be safe because… No, don't stop there. Tell me. Why? Well, he thought you knew everything, but it didn't bother you because he could, take care of her needs in a way you couldn't. That's ridiculous. I practically exploded and stood up so fast that my chair fell over with a loud crack. No way. Please, sit down, Mr. Davis, Kelsey said firmly, and the young weatherman walked around the table and pulled a chair over to me. I didn't just sit down, I more or less lowered myself onto it. People started asking me how well I knew Abby before we were married, and honestly, there wasn't much I could say. I knew she had a certain reputation, but I didn't question it. What had happened in the past didn't interest me, and we never brought it up in conversation. When we were together, it didn't matter. Strangely enough, I didn't doubt the truth of their words. though I tried hard to convince them that such boasting meant nothing. But noticing the slightly pitying looks on their faces, I finally fell silent. "I hope you understand," said the inspector, "that we have a very good reason for asking you this, Mr. Davis. The fact is that a man who until recently was your wife's lover has just fallen to the ground from a height of about 4,000 feet, possibly due to a malfunction of a parachute belonging to a very good friend of yours." This time, I'm sure the color disappeared from my face as I realized what he was implying. "I wasn't the one who packed it," I reminded them. "And before you ask, I didn't touch it after Sammy arrived either. He was with her the whole time." "Did she take it with her when she went to the ladies' room, Mr. Davis?" But, but I didn't take it," I insisted. I wouldn't. I wouldn't have done it. Oh, for God's sake, it's silly. There were other people there. They would have seen. She'd only been gone a minute or two." "It's okay, Robbie," Mark said as my voice started to rise. "We're not trying to accuse you of anything. Please understand that we are forced to ask these questions. Perhaps you can explain why you thought it wasn't an accident." And I recounted to them, as best I could, what Samantha had told me about the emails she had seen. I said that I had strongly advised her to go to the police about it, but I don't know if she followed my advice or not. I explained how the company's finances were structured, that Gerald was left with only a paycheck and that if he and Samantha broke up, he would likely be out of work and, with nothing noteworthy on his resume, would have a hard time finding a decent job. "And what would his position be if Mrs. Lloyd Smith had been involved in today's incident?" the inspector asked. "I can't be sure," I replied cautiously. "Why not?" "Well, I don't know whether Sammy made a will or anything else." "Suppose she didn't?" "In that case," I replied after a few minutes' reflection, "he would probably be a very rich man. In addition to the factory, he has 3 retail carpet stores under a different name that are doing very well, plus a lot of secure investments that her father made. I think he's going to get it all." They asked me how much it would all be worth, and after I named a rather modest sum, their eyebrows almost disappeared behind their hairline. Naturally, I was pleased that the focus of the questions had shifted where it needed to go, and there were many more questions about Gerald. I spoke openly of my disdain for the man, and even told the story of how I'd punched him. I didn't want to hide anything if they were likely to eventually find out. I have no idea how long the interrogation lasted. It seemed like half a lifetime to me, but eventually, they decided that was enough for today. The light outside began to fade, and they asked me to come to the police station the next morning along with several other important witnesses. As I rose uncertainly to my feet, Inspector Kelsey said, "One more thing, Mr. Davis. If I was expecting some insightful and profound Columbo-style question, I was disappointed." He asked the standard question asked of anyone who is into skydiving, and I gave him the same standard answer most of us do. "How can an intelligent human being do what you do? Why do you get out of the airplane when it's still in the air?" "Because the door is open," I said. Chapter 4. The investigation dragged on. As Mark had told me, Inspector Kelsey was a careful and very thorough policeman who was never in a hurry. To begin with, a great deal of suspicion fell on me, and on Samantha. Because the data card on her parachute, the one with information about the reserve parachute, including type date, last packed, owner, serial number, etc., indicated that it had been repacked the previous week before she went home, and that the signature on that process was mine. Sam's husband confirmed this at first, saying that I usually did it for her and that he hadn't had to touch it in weeks. He said that Sammy and I were having an affair and that she started blackmailing me into divorcing Abby. According to him, she told me that she wanted me more than anything in the world, and being a spoiled rich bitch, she was determined to do anything to get her way. According to him, she told him everything and even offered him a large sum of money to agree to the divorce. Naturally, being such a loving husband, he thought of his wife first. He tried to warn her that it was dangerous to get involved with people like me, who grew up in the most disadvantaged neighborhoods. "We're capable of anything," he told her, but she refused to listen because she'd spent her life getting her way and pushing people around. It was a feeble attempt at best, and when forensics confirmed that the handwriting on the data card wasn't mine, it was all for naught. As Gerald came under scrutiny, he tried more and more furiously to get out of what he had done. When he was accused of trying to kill his wife to secure his future wealth, he completely denied it. He also completely denied Samantha's account of the emails to the mystery woman who helped him devise the plan to kill her. She didn't have the time or ability to do what I suggested and get copies of them. And when his laptop was taken in for forensics, it was found to be new and barely used. Of course, he said he just needed to upgrade it, and he cleaned out the old one and gave it to a charity that helps seniors learn how to use computers. That turned out to be true, but by the time the laptop was traced back to its new owner, it already had a new hard drive in it and was completely useless as evidence. Once again, when the case against him turned out to be nothing more than circumstantial, he tried again to blame it on Samantha. He admitted to having a couple of brief affairs, but said it was because she wasn't interested in having sex with him after the first few weeks of their marriage, mostly because she was probably getting what she needed from me. The very thought of some mysterious woman offering all sorts of sexual favors with no strings attached, which was what Sammy said the letters were about, was ridiculous. It had never occurred to him to engage in such things, and he found them rather repulsive. The investigation seemed to have stalled, although it was now clear that the parachute had been rigged to fail and that someone had deliberately tried to end Samantha's life. But I rather admired how patiently the police went about their business, checking everything over and over again, calling each of us in for questioning whenever anything new came to light. But there was no sign of any real progress. By then, of course, I was living alone. Arriving home the evening after the accident, I found that Abby had been drinking heavily. As soon as I entered the house, she hugged me and told me how glad she was that I was okay. Apparently, the news on the local radio station was talking about a fatal accident at the skydiving club, but didn't give any details about who died. I suppose I'd better just mention that as a result of the fall, Joe died instantly. Unfortunately, when St. John's Hospital staff arrived on the scene, they thought they detected some movement. Whether it was just the body settling or gases escaping, it's impossible to say, but two of them saw it and one of them attempted CPR. According to regulations, CPR must continue until the doctor pronounces the patient dead, and the official report says he was dead on arrival at the hospital. So, while the radio news may have been a bit hasty, they were right. Anyway, Abby at that point had no idea who the victim might be, and that was the first question she asked. I shook my head in response, walked to the bathroom and told her to go back into the living room and pour me a drink. I also told her that I would be out soon and for her to wait, then I would tell her everything she needed to know. When I returned to her about 10 minutes later, she was glued to the television news, which was showing a short clip shot on a cell phone, showing Joe racing toward his doom. From this distance, of course, it was impossible to make out whether it was a man or a woman, so it was only natural to say, "That's Samantha's parachute." Because Sammy's parachute was custom-made and different. "Yes, it is," I growled, and she turned her head in my direction as I stepped forward and picked up a glass of Tullamore Dew, 12-year-old Irish whiskey. "Oh God, I'm so sorry, Robbie. I mean, I didn't like her, but she didn't use it," I said coldly and stared at her. Then, who was it?" she asked, and I saw the tall glass of vodka and Coke shake in her hand as I spoke, and her eyes, those brown eyes I had once loved so much, widened beyond belief. "It was Joe Carpenter," I said slowly, and saw her face crumple, and then tears roll down her cheeks. She finally managed to look away and mumble that he was a good guy, and that it had all been a long time ago. "I don't think a couple months is that long ago, Abby," I replied quietly, and saw her flinch, but she tried to lie anyway. "I don't know what you mean," she tried. "I dated him when we worked at the factory, but nothing serious." And then, as she always did when she felt cornered, she tried to go on the attack. "Anyway, the poor guy just died for crying out loud. Can't you do a little bit of what, Abby?" I snapped back. "Respect? Like the respect you show me?" "I don't know what you—" "Stop it," I shouted. And she suddenly fell silent, realizing how angry I was. "You've been having fun with him, and with a few others at the factory, before you managed to get a hold of me. So you didn't have to lie to me. And you started having fun with him again, regularly, shortly after we were married." "I'm over it, Robbie, I honestly am." I told him it was over. "Where is it over, Abby? Don't try to fool me. It's too late now. I found out everything. Stop lying to me, bitch." At that moment, something seemed to click. She stopped whimpering and started ranting about respecting the dead, how she only loved me, and if I hadn't been so timid about new experiences in the bedroom, she would never have been tempted to get involved with him after the wedding. When I said bullshit, she flew into a rage and declared that she would leave for her sister until I calmed down. And that's when I walked into the bedroom, caught her trying to put on her favorite leather jacket, and handed her the bag I'd packed when she thought I was still in the bathroom. Here, that's enough for today, I growled. You can come back for the rest in a couple days. What? What the hell are you talking about? I'm talking about it's over, Abby. You're already in the past. Now get out of my sight before I do something we'll both regret. You can't do that, Robbie, she howled. You can't. You can't leave me like this. It's too late. I've already quit, I told her as I guided her to the door and opened it. I'm going to see a lawyer in the morning to get a divorce. And I suggest you do the same. For a few days, she begged and pleaded with me to take her back, and then when she realized it wasn't going to happen, she started threatening me with reprisal. I kept my cool and just referred her to my lawyer. He had already told me that since the apartment belonged to me before we started living together, she had no rights to it, and since there were no children and she was working, I was unlikely to be obligated to pay her much, if anything at all. Meanwhile, as people at the factory started to figure out what had happened, I started hearing a lot about what she was like when she worked there. According to one of the supervisors and the head foreman, Abby was known for giving away her favors quite freely. The main recipient was the late Joe Carpenter. There were many other recipients, but Joe was the only one who bragged that he was not required to use a condom. I was told that there was a pile of old carpets in storage that are still referred to as Abby's bed. It was almost certainly the one I had my first experience with her on. There was even speculation, never confirmed, that when I danced with Samantha at the Christmas party, Abby was so infuriated by it that she practically dragged Joe there for a session before doing the same to me. If that was true, it certainly explained the warmth and the smooth glide. I also learned that a couple months after the wedding, she started coming to the factory on her lunch hour from time to time and taking Joe somewhere for a while. If he wasn't working that day, someone else was usually chosen. Most of them obviously thought I was a fool for marrying her, but since honor among thieves, they didn't say anything. Of course, there wasn't much I could do about it now, but everything was put aside for later. Eventually, of course, thanks to the persistence of the police, all the pieces of the puzzle began to slowly fall into place. Eventually, they came to ask if they could inspect the computers we had in the house, and I didn't hesitate to hand over the 2 laptops I had bought for us. I was even a little surprised they hadn't done it sooner. It took about 10 days for the inspection, and that's when the excrement really made itself known. It was a Wednesday morning that I'll probably never forget when I got a call from Sergeant Mark Haley, who called me into work and very politely asked if I could arrange to come down to the station and bring Samantha with me by 11 o'clock. I, of course, agreed and went to ask Sammy if she would agree to come with me. To be honest, even though we worked at the same place and our paths naturally crossed, I hadn't seen much of her since that incident. I knew, of course, that she had kicked Gerald out of the house and that his drunken attempts to get back into the house had very quickly resulted in a restraining order against him. I also knew that he had been suspended from his job, but was still receiving a paycheck at that point. But I noticed that Sammy had become withdrawn and often looked like she was reliving a nightmare for real. Even her luxurious golden curls seemed disheveled and lifeless. I guessed that the sight of Joe Carpenter falling to the ground still haunted her, as did the certainty that it might well have been her. When she agreed to accompany me, there was an almost submissive tone in her voice, and the ride there was rather uncomfortable with little conversation. Upon arrival, we were ushered into a large and surprisingly cozy office, where Mark, Kelsey, and the very constable who had taken the first notes were waiting for us. The only surprise was that there was another woman in the room, Abby. We were immediately told that although we were only there to help them with their investigation, we had the right to have a lawyer present if we so desired. Neither of us seemed willing to take advantage of this offer. We were again shown the recording equipment that was supposed to be used. I stood up first. 2 identical laptops were placed in front of me and asked which one was mine. It wasn't difficult. Mine was used for both work and play and had the inevitable light battle damage. It was mostly minor scratches on the lid, but there was also one easily noticeable chip in the corner where I'd dropped it clumsily out of its case. So I didn't hesitate to acknowledge mine and explained why it was so easy to do. The next question asked if I had ever used the one Abby had, and I again admitted without hesitation that I had sometimes. All right, I know we're always advised not to leave valuables in the car, I told them, but there are times when my laptop is left in the trunk. Instead of going after it, I used Abby's laptop if she wasn't behind it. I usually just looked at the headlines, followed sports scores, stuff like that. You didn't use it to send emails? Inspector Kelsey asked. No, I always use my own for that. We had a shared email address that we always use for shopping and things like that, and it's on both computers. But I also have a private one on my laptop. It's used to send messages to members and sometimes to buy unexpected gifts. The two policemen looked at each other, each nodded slightly, and then said I could go if I wanted. I thought for a minute or two, but then said, "If you don't mind, gentlemen, I'd better stay." Mrs. Lloyd Smith was, well, a little fragile after that incident. I can't know what you're going to demand of her, but I think she might need the support of a friend. I heard Abby's deliberately loud, mocking snort when I used the word friend, but I managed to ignore it and watch as another look passed from Mark to Kelsey. They obviously had a good working relationship because they seemed to read each other's minds and made a quick decision. They said I could stay, but I'd have to sit in another chair, away from the table, and promise not to say anything. Moving to another seat, I watched the rest of the drama as Kelsey pulled out a large stack of A4 papers. Sammy looked a little lethargic and not too interested in what was going on. Abby was restless. I didn't know how long she'd been there before us, but I could tell from the signs that she needed a cigarette. It reminded me of the time I had to pay a lot of money to a cleaning agency to get rid of their vile odor in my apartment. "I'd like you to take a look at them, if you'd be so kind, Mrs. Lloyd Smith," Inspector Kelsey said in a soft voice and smiled kindly. "And then tell me if they are familiar to you. Please, take your time. I want you to be absolutely sure, and I'd like you to read them all, if you don't mind." Saying that, he held out a stack of papers and Samantha flipped the top one over. I heard a sharp gasp, followed almost immediately by a sob that seemed to shake her frail figure. I wanted to get up, but my hand swung away from me. Samantha seemed to take several deep breaths, trying to regain control of herself, and I realized she had succeeded when she finally rolled over onto the next sheet. The silence and tension in the room was excruciating as Samantha continued to read. All that was missing to fully dramatize the scene was the steady ticking of the wall clock and the second hand determining the passing moments. But the only sound was the slight whirring of the recording devices and the hesitant breathing of the 6 people present. It had been cool when we'd first arrived, but now I could feel the dampness of sweat under my palms, and as time stretched slowly, I moved as quietly and inconspicuously as possible into the hard chair. Sammy must have been 2/3 of the way through before she finally looked up at the 2 policemen and said in a pitying voice, "I've read them before. I told Robbie about them when I found them on Gerald's computer. Is it really so necessary to make me read them all?" "It is important, Mrs. Lloyd Smith," Inspector Kelsey confirmed. "I realize it must be difficult, but it would be very helpful if you could continue, if you please." As she returned to her task, I tried to catch Mark's eye, but he resolutely kept his eyes on Sammy, so I tried to gauge Abby's reaction to what was happening. She still looked restless, like she'd sell her soul for a cigarette. But from where she was sitting, it was impossible to see what Sammy was reading. And I realized she was driven by an almost irresistible curiosity. The last few pages changed everything. First, Sammy cried out in shock, then she lifted the page toward her as if she needed to bring it closer to believe what she was reading. Then there was a sigh, almost a sob of anguish, and she slowly placed the last page face down on the stack of what she was reading. Without saying a word, she pulled a small pack of tissues out of her bag, pressed one of them to her face, and began to sob uncontrollably. "Look! What the hell is going on here?" Abby demanded loudly. "What do these papers say? And why am I here?" "We'll be right there," Kelsey replied calmly, but Abby wasn't satisfied. "No, that's not good enough," she shouted. "I've been sitting here while you've been making her read crap in those papers, and I've been ignored. Just because it's slutty," she exclaimed, nodding her head in my direction. "Turns out to be rich, you treat her like a goddamn princess, and I'm left here with no idea what—" "Very well, Mrs. Davis," Kelsey said, not raising his voice, but using a timbre that allowed for no argument and immediately led to silence. "Mrs. Lloyd Smith has examined a number of emails that were found on your computer. In them, Mr. Smith and you planned not only an affair, but also the destruction of his wife. I was like a goldfish that had been taken out of a bowl of water and placed on the carpet. Abby's mouth opened and closed, but not a sound came out of it. Her hands flapped uselessly at her sides, and I could see that her legs were beginning to tremble. At last, coughing and spitting, she managed to utter, "It's not true. This is a mistake. This is ridiculous." And as I moved forward to comfort the sobbing Samantha, she glared at me and said, "Tell them, Robbie, I wouldn't do anything like that. You know I wouldn't. I don't even like that creepy bastard. Tell them." And when I ignored her and gently put my hand on Sammy's shoulder, she nearly screamed, "Save it! I'm not staying here to be accused of something like that. I want to go home. I'm leaving." And turned toward the door, but found the detective constable already standing in front of her. She turned to face Mark and Kelsey again, and then the inspector spoke up. "Very well. There may be other charges that will follow, but for now, Abigail Ruth Davies, I am placing you under arrest for the attempted murder of Samantha Lloyd Smith. You do not need to say anything." And that's when my wife passed out. If I had reacted quickly enough, I might have been able to catch her before she hit the ground. At the same time, I figured it would be a much lighter blow than the one she intended for Sammy, so I just made a half-hearted attempt that was unlikely to succeed. Chapter 5. Though God's mills grind slowly, they grind very finely. These words from Longfellow's poem came to my mind more than once in the months that followed, and even more often than not when I found myself in the company of the detectives responsible for investigating the death of Joseph Carpenter. No one seemed in any hurry to bring the case to trial, but in fact it was an extremely complex case that would likely require a great deal of expert testimony to prove that it qualified as a murder. During this time, I managed to talk Samantha into taking a vacation, and when she returned from there, she looked a little refreshed. At the same time, her enthusiasm for the day-to-day running of the business had clearly waned, and she had left most of it to me, Freddie Watson, the head salesman, and Millicent Ferguson, who had been her personal assistant many years before and had performed the same task under her father. Now they were both being inducted into the board of directors. When Gerald Smith finally broke down a few weeks later and admitted his involvement in the affair, it seemed that Abby would do the same, and it would all be over. But she still adamantly denied involvement. I thought that it was nothing more than a formality, that once he confessed, they would have no problem convicting her, but gradually I realized that it was Mark who was dragging things out because he wasn't entirely sure of her role in what was going on. He admitted this to me when we met informally at a club on Saturday night for a quiet drink together. Not that he discussed it in detail, just that he managed to convey his doubts without going into too much detail. Naturally, I was tempted to tell him that Abby was a skilled liar, and I'd seen it firsthand. The way she managed to conceal her extracurricular activities and the extent of them was astonishing. And even looking back, I don't think I missed any obvious clues at the time. However, I was wise enough to keep quiet about it, and educated enough to realize that she still denied, absolutely, any knowledge of the damning emails, or even any contact with Gerald Smith. The club itself was in the process of liquidation. After Joe's tragic death, his heart had been taken out of him. Membership numbers had dwindled, and with it the team-building weekends with accelerated freefall, AFF courses that had brought in so much essential income. Even the cost of renting an airplane became a crippling burden, especially when the usual 3 flights per hour with 10 jumpers was reduced to 1 per hour with an average of 3 people jumping. Some of us, including me, who were there that day, kept walking up the long and wide outside steps, but I think most did it to prove to themselves that they hadn't lost their nerve. Samantha, for example, took 1 jump and then announced that it would be her last. Mark did the same, and I've since done 3. There was another club, 50 miles away, that was in the process of buying parachute equipment, and negotiations were underway with a small flying club to lease the clubhouse and other facilities. I was saddened by this, but the publicity we were getting meant that it was probably inevitable. A few days afterwards, the trial began. I didn't see it start because I was to be called as a witness. I thought it wouldn't happen because I had a vague idea of spousal privilege, but apparently I was wrong and wasn't going to make a fuss. Everything about this trial was intimidating, from the ancient and slightly stately courtroom setting to the grumpy barristers and their colleagues who never seemed to be in a hurry to get on with their business. The prosecuting barrister very slowly told me all the events of that fateful day, and that was the easy part. He then moved on to the subject of the relationship between me and my wife, which was not easy. First, I was shown some documents for Samantha to read, and it wasn't hard to see why she was upset. The first ones were nothing more than teases, internet chatter. Of course, they were anonymous at first. They were conversations about things they would like to do, but were turned down due to reluctant partners, and soon they became much more explicit. I was asked if I knew of my wife's desire to try any of these things, since she mentioned that she couldn't convince her husband to do them, and I was forced to admit that it was pretty much the same thing she was trying to get me to do. Somewhere along the way, they revealed their true identities to each other. Gerald admitted that because of his feelings for me, he would have been even more excited to play with her, but she brushed him off, saying that any such liaison, if found out, would mean an instant end to her marriage and, more importantly, the lifestyle I was providing for her. She insisted that for a certain period of time, everything be limited to chit-chat and nothing else. At the same time, the details of their mutual desires became more and more explicit. It was all very unpleasant, but it got even worse when they started planning how to get rid of their partners so that they could indulge their desires. At first, things had been indecisive, to say the least. Neither of them wanted to lose their dinner ticket, and it wasn't until Abby suggested that some sort of accident would solve their problem that things took a more serious turn. Although neither of them specified what form the accident would take, it was quite clear that it would be fatal. At the end of the correspondence, Abby wrote that he did not want to be left out of pocket if the case was successful, and he suddenly discovered that he had a fortune. An insurance policy was needed to which they would both sign to be bound to each other in the event of success. Such an assurance was given and received, though no trace of it could be found. And the day before the accident, Gerald sent a message saying that the next day would be perfect and that she should stay away and be conspicuous elsewhere. The last text was sent the day she reminded him that they should stay away from each other for at least 6 months until things settled down. Fortunately, there was a convenient break in the proceedings after that, and then I started being questioned by the defense. However, they were wasting their time on me. I stuck firmly to what I knew for sure and did not back down one bit. I'm sure my regret that the woman I loved had turned out to be so evil sounded pretty strong, as well as a clear sense of resentment, but in the end, I managed to come out unscathed. Over the next few days, I attended court where I was read much of the prosecution's version of the case. How the emails carefully hidden in Abby's computer had been discovered. The spelling mistakes in her writing and the lack of capitalization, which was in keeping with her habits. The timing of the messages, which in each case coincided with the time she was home, usually in the middle of the night when I was supposedly sound asleep in our bed. The attached photographs, often in exceptionally lewd poses, and similar photos sent to her by Gerald. It was all very convincing, but worst of all for her was Gerald Smith's statement, in which he admitted to everything. Judging by their demeanor, the defense attorneys were annoyed that she would simply not plead guilty, perhaps citing mental incapacity and seeking leniency. But she flatly refused, and they had to go to great lengths to refute a lot of obvious evidence. She even, at her own insistence, took the stand herself and simply denied knowing about the emails, the attempt to kill Samantha, or any contact with Gerald Smith. Despite the prosecution giving her a real day, she remained adamant, insisting that someone else was to blame, and even tried to bring up Gerald's original story that Sammy had blackmailed me, although he later admitted that he had made it all up. I did not attend the summation of the court hearing. I had to attend a very important board meeting on which the entire future of the business depended. Apparently, it took the prosecution a few hours and the defense a little less, so I was not present when the jury returned after lunch with a unanimous guilty verdict. Under English law, destruction is punishable by life imprisonment, and if it is committed with the expectation of benefiting by death, that automatically means a minimum of 30 years. I believe Abby fainted during the reading of the verdict and a few days later had a tantrum during the reading of the verdict, but I wasn't in court to see it happen. I had already told her that from my point of view she was already history, and now there could be no doubt about it. Chapter 6. The day was breathtakingly beautiful. I sat on the terrace of a villa near Grasse, say on the Côte d'Azur side of the French Riviera, on top of a hill near the village of Sparacades, and enjoyed the magnificent view of Lake Saint Cassien the Bay of Mandaluyong, and the hills of Estoril. I ate a light lunch and relaxed with a glass of cool beer, enjoying the company of a man I hadn't seen for the best part of 8 years. Mark Haley was now the chief inspector of the Cheshire Constabulary. He had put on a little weight since I had last seen him, but he still looked trim and slim, and the gray in his hair in no way detracted from his attractiveness. He was in Marseille, he said, investigating some connection with drug smuggling, and knowing that I lived nearby, he decided to look me up. He found my number in a book and called, offering to have a beer together in a bar. But I had invited him to dinner with my family, and it was nice to know what was going on at home. Now my wife decided to go watch the kids, leaving us alone. They're wonderful kids, he told me, referring to 4-year-old James Griffin Davis and his 2-year-old sister Claire. And he was right. They were gorgeous, and I loved them both to bits. But don't you ever miss home? It's home now, Mark, I told him sincerely. We sometimes go there for a couple days to see relatives, but I don't think we'll ever be able to live there again. Too many bad memories? Not enough sunshine. We smiled and sipped from our glasses. I had a feeling there was more to his visit than he'd told me, but it was up to him to decide when to end that musing. So, how did you two end up together? He asked, nodding toward the house. And I told him the simple truth. To be honest, Mark, I didn't expect things to work out between us. In fact, it took at least a year before we both realized that a real feeling had developed between us. Being without partners, we teamed up when we needed to attend some events and so on, but I think we were both so hurt that we were afraid to go there again. I think it was something that developed very slowly until we were both ready to admit that we had real feelings for each other. And all of this was absolutely true. We grew together slowly and steadily throughout the first year after the trial. In a way, given the state she was in, I became a rock for Samantha to hold on to. But I didn't want to jeopardize what we had by trying to turn it into an unwanted attempt at an affair. It was after dinner with a group of Japanese businessmen and their wives that the opportunity to change finally presented itself. It was my turn to drive, even though she hardly drank, and as I was dropping her off at her house and wishing her good night, she suddenly said, "You know, Robbie, I sometimes feel like we spend more time together than most married couples." It was a simple remark, but it silenced her for a minute or two. And then, as if embarrassed by the thought, she started to get out of the car, but I gently held her hand, and when she turned, replied, "I don't doubt that, and I love being with you. I just wish we could spend a lot more time together." From that point on, we started dating properly. It seemed to be almost an unwritten rule that we weren't going to jump into bed together, and I was fine with that. In fact, it wasn't until I reminded her of what she had said about spending a lot of time together and suggested that we think about making our relationship more official that she agreed to marry me. It was a 6-month courtship followed by years of friendship, and the wedding itself was very quiet, with only close family and friends invited. Our first night together was at a honeymoon hotel in Barbados. It was a little awkward at first. Neither of us had been in a long-term relationship, and I think we were both nervous about our inadequacy. However, she turned out to be surprisingly shy and, given her previous history, surprisingly inexperienced. So I told Mark that we'd had an old-fashioned courtship, that we'd finally decided to get married, and that now we both loved each other more than ever before, and that love continued to grow day by day. "Yes, I can quite understand that," he smiled, and then, "Have you heard anything about your previous partners?" I only shook my head. I didn't want to know. They were part of the past. Gerald seems to be doing pretty well in prison. Honestly, I think he's getting a little more entrenched in prison. I saw him a few weeks ago. Of course, he's still bitter about Abby. He still insists that it was her idea, even though he agreed with her. He says she promised to be the kind of slut he always dreamed of, and he can't forgive her for refusing to take responsibility for what happened. He might be eligible for parole in a few years, but I'm not even sure he'll want that. I tried to interrupt him before he could say anything else, but he continued. Abby, of course, is a different matter. She had a complete mental breakdown. She still denies her involvement in the plot to kill Samantha. She still denies knowing about those incriminating letters. Psychologists say it's something to do with denial, probably some kind of bipolar disorder or something. It has even been suggested that there are 2 separate personalities at work in her, and that the currently dominant personality has erased all memories of what the other one did. Of course, this means that she is unlikely to be released for a long time. I mean, she knows she'll have a better chance if she confesses to what she did, but she won't. Which brings up the big question, doesn't it, Robbie? He finished and took another sip of his beer. Hmm? What's the question? I asked as casually as possible. He set his glass down very slowly and we were face to face when he said, "How did you do it, Robbie?" "I beg your pardon?" I said with a surprised look on my face, but he only smiled crookedly. "Robbie, I'm a cop," he said. "I may not be Sherlock Holmes, but I like to think I'm pretty good at what I do. I take my time and do my best to get things right. I'm a cautious man, and I hate the thought of sending the wrong person. Now, Mr. Kelsey, you remember him, I believe?" I nodded, and he continued. "Well, he had a very different attitude toward me. He was all about results, on making the numbers look good, and if it was a high-profile case like Joe Carpenter's death, on getting results quickly and looking good in the press. That's probably why he's made it to chief constable, and I won't get any further up the ranks until I retire." "Yes, but give me a few minutes, Robbie. It won't take long because I have a car coming to pick me up soon. I just need to talk it out because it's been tormenting me for years, okay?" I nodded again and started to speak, but he held up his hand with the words, "Please?" And I fell silent. "You see, when we first investigated, I felt sorry for you, don't get me wrong. I mean, you seemed like the only one who didn't know what Abby was. You seemed like a poor, love-blinded husband who didn't know his wife was cheating on him with Joe and a few other people from the factory where she worked, namely Donald and Malcolm. But gradually I realized I was wrong, didn't I? You knew that, didn't you?" I tried my best to look embarrassed and a little annoyed. He was right, of course. It was the main reason I'd gotten Abby a job away from the factory, hoping it would stop. But I was well aware that it didn't. "You've done a good job, Robbie. You're very good. I have to give you credit for that. Looking back, I can see how you very carefully and very slowly drew Samantha to you. How you didn't judge your husband, but just gently showed her that you were a better man than he was, and how you made her practically dependent on you when it came to running the business. Well, that's what a lot of men in your place would do, wouldn't they? They'd want to, I don't know, have an affair with her? Or even find a replacement for her for when you're ready to dump Abby? It would be unpleasant in some people's eyes, but I think it would be understandable. But that wasn't enough for you, was it? You're a landlubber like me. And there was a lot of resentment in you. You broke away from your roots. You became successful and rich, but you lost all respect because of the way Abby and her lovers behaved. And most of your resentment was directed at Gerald Smythe, wasn't it?" He paused, expecting me to say something, but I just kept my poker face and told him to go on. It was his story. "Oh, you don't have to worry, Robbie. I know that if I tried to prove any of this, I'd probably end up in the same institution as your ex. I'm just doing this for my own satisfaction. I mean, I had a problem with the fact that there was never any doubt that Gerald actually planted the parachute to get sweet Samantha killed. I'm sure the idea of getting his hands on all that money appealed to him enough that he felt the risk was justified. So I have no problem with sending him to prison. No, what really bothers me, Robbie, is how he was talked into doing it. I couldn't figure out exactly what was wrong, but I knew something was. So I did everything I could to stall the investigation. But Kelsey, of course, was not satisfied. He saw that his next promotion depended on the successful completion of the investigation. And frankly, as soon as he realized I was stalling, I was shoved aside rather rudely. Not until later, much later, when I learned that Abby still denied knowledge of the emails, I began to question whether she had actually sent them. And that led me to another thought. Knowing what we know about Abby, I realized that she could have had such an affair with Gerald if she really wanted to. You see, I realized that for all the dirt and passion that seemed to be in them, they were written by a man with a very cold and calculating mind, and that's not exactly how I would describe Abby, would you? "You were never married to her," I replied, keeping a straight expression on my face, and he smiled. "True. But let me offer you an alternative scenario to the one everyone is used to believing. Let's imagine, for example, that you've thought it all out. Very carefully, of course, because you always think carefully. And came up with a plan that would destroy both Gerald and Abby, give you the woman you really wanted to be with, and Well, I don't know if that's a good thing or not. Would get rid of the horny man. Let's imagine that you, hypothetically of course, opened an email account on your wife's computer, which she'll never find because she's not particularly computer savvy, and took on her persona to start communicating with Gerald. Let's say, for example, that you slipped her sleeping pills when you wanted to do this. Let's imagine that you harnessed her own strange sexual desires and amplified them, knowing that they would appeal to someone like Gerald. Let's imagine for a moment that you were able to mimic her style, even her mistakes, to make it look like she'd come up with the plan herself and found another way to communicate it to him. Admittedly, I didn't understand how you did it, but let's assume you did. And let's imagine the relief you felt when he totally bought it. Of course, I have no way of knowing how you managed to set it up so that Joe was wearing a fake parachute, or even whether it was part of the plan and not just a bonus. But I'm sure you must have been thrilled when you saw him walk into the airplane with Samantha's harness on. You were cold-blooded enough, or hateful enough, to sit there and watch him fall out of the sky. I guess, Robbie, I could never relate to that. And then you kept your composure under interrogation, convincingly enough, knowing that the spotlight would soon shift to Gerald. So I reviewed my notes after the trial and noticed that you were the only person that day who didn't ask us if we knew how Joe was doing. At the time, I reasoned that it was because you were experienced enough to realize he had no chance of survival, but now I realize it was because you were glad he was dead. If I'm right, and I know I'll never be able to prove it, you must be the most cruel, calculating, and cold-blooded bastard I've ever met. And that, believe me, is no small thing for a cop of my caliber. He fell silent after that, but his eyes remained fixed on mine, and I said, Abby is a very sick woman, Mark. You've created a whole new scenario out of the simple fact that she refuses to admit what she's done. The truth is that she conspired to heartlessly and for her own gratification and enrichment destroy a very wonderful man. And she can't accept that her scheming led to the death of a man she may have cared more about than she realized. You're spinning well, Mark, but I think it's more likely you're being held back by an overactive imagination than anything else. I don't know what else to say, except that I'd really appreciate it if you didn't come back here again. Just as I finished speaking, a Renault Megane appeared on the road and stopped under the terrace. We walked up to it, and before he got into the back seat, he turned and said, There's a chance you might get away with it, Robbie. I don't think you'll ever have to answer for what you've done, unless a higher power is waiting for you. I'm not going to dwell on it. I have my own life, and I don't think I'm going to want to take you on, because frankly, you're the most ruthless and dangerous man I know. You don't seem to have a guilty conscience, but I still hope you'll think about what you did to Abby. Maybe remember how you used to treat her? She's been punished enough already, don't you think? I watched the car drive away and turned around to see Samantha waving goodbye to her from one of the windows. Turning back to my beer, I drained it carefully and thought about what he'd said. He was right about a lot of things, but very wrong if he thought she'd suffered enough already. The only good thing about Joe's death was that Samantha had made the decision to talk to me on her own, rather than me using a prepared excuse to prevent her from getting on the plane and leaving. I knew full well that Joe and Donald would come and borrow our parachutes. They had a reputation for saving money that way rather than paying to rent them. And I had no doubt at all which one of them would take Sammy's parachute. And I also knew that Donald and Malcolm were not living too well at the moment. After we sold the business to a Japanese company, the new regime didn't sit well with them, and neither did some of the others. They were labeled troublemakers, and despite their long service, they were sent out the door without a word. I'm dangerous? I mean, I'm just an accountant, aren't I? Samantha and I had spent some of the money to buy the villa we now lived in, and there was more than enough left over to live in reasonable style and comfort on interest alone. However, old habits are ineradicable, so I still worked from home, looking after the financial affairs of some of our wealthy neighbors. As I rose to my feet, Sammy appeared in the doorway and hurried toward me. She still looked slim enough not to notice she was carrying our third child. Did Mark leave? She asked. She asked. She asked. Yeah, back to good old England. I grinned. You're welcome, she said with a mocking grin. And then, anyway, the kids are napping right now, and I was thinking... I raised my eyebrows and waited until after a moment she chuckled and said, It's no use trying to get me to ask. You rotten pig? I'm going to lie down for an hour or two. Then she got up and left. By the time I got into the house and closed the door behind me, I had forgotten about Mark Haley and everything else in the story. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.